Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I know it's a little bit cold in here, but I have been told that the heat is warming up, so bear with us. And I'm Rochelle Steiner, Director of the Public Art Fund, and I have the, thank you, I have the fan club over here, and I have the fantastic opportunity to welcome you and to introduce Katherine Sullivan. Karen Cooney, who is the director of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics, would normally welcome everybody first, but she's not able to come tonight, so I'm very happy to do double duty and speak for both of us. It is a fantastic collaboration that the Public Art Fund is able to have with the New School and the Vera List Center, and we are incredibly indebted to both their team and our own team for making these events possible. Tonight is the last of our 3 fall Public Art Fund talks. Last but not least, we have been eagerly anticipating Katherine Sullivan coming. Her work is incredibly rich, rigorous, and complex, and so it is a great honor to be able to hear from her directly about her installations, which combine theater, dance, music, film, and visual art. The performers in her piece often explore written texts that she refers to as stylistic economies, gestural regimes, and reenactments of history and conceptual orthodoxies. Her work is shot and performed within locations that are very much layered with social history and politics. Her characters are often playing off of one another and create somewhat anxious narratives that sometimes seem unresolved, but actually have a woven thread throughout them that start to reveal themselves. Her topics have ranged incredibly wide-reaching. However, I think that perhaps her true medium is the ensemble itself. She does bring together a lot of people to create these beautiful works. Katherine lives and works in Chicago, and she's come in especially for this talk. She was born in Los Angeles and attended California Institute of the Arts and the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. She has had solo shows in many locations throughout the world, including the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, the Smart Museum of Art in Chicago, and Tate Modern in London. She's represented by Metro Pictures Gallery, where she had a fantastic show just last year. So it is an absolute pleasure to welcome her tonight. I think some people will continue to trickle in, so if you could just, hopefully not have them disrupt you. And Katherine is very happy to take questions, so hopefully this will turn into something of a dialogue as well. So thank you so much for coming. Our program for the spring talks will be out shortly, and you can find the information on our website. Thanks so much.
So thank you very much, Rochelle, for inviting me. These situations are often a little tense for me because they usually demand quite a bit of certainty. I think that if there's one thing that you could say that about the work that I produce is that it hopes to be uncertain. It hopes to be inconclusive. It hopes to be at times incoherent. Sometimes there's a rationale for that. Other times it's a matter of things which are produced. It comes from the evolution of the work. It's being produced with so many different collaborators, most importantly the actors and the ensembles who participate in them. So it's also awkward to come into these situations and to, in a sense, be the representative of a lot of people's work and a lot of people's input into the project. So there will be an ongoing sense of awkwardness that you might detect. But I wanted to start out kind of without getting right into images or any of the work itself, but to kind of try to talk a little bit about how what happens when you see the work that I make, what happens kind of intellectually, what happens on a spectatorial level, because it's often hard for me to describe these pieces in a linear sense. I think of them very much as kind of an overlap. The experience of watching the work is very much to kind of experience spheres which overlap. Sometimes they resolve themselves, other times they don't. Things which are familiar that you're experiencing at the exact same time with things that you're totally unfamiliar with. And so this is a sort of schematic that I made after I completed the last project, Triangle of Need. And I just wanted to show it to you as a schematic first, because I think that it'll sort of help in terms of maybe looking at some of the other work. I don't know if it's necessarily to help you understand the work, the ideas, the concepts, but more to understand what's important to me, which is the experience of watching it. So on the left-hand side, and this is for a project that I'll talk in a little bit more detail later, but on the left-hand side, the kind of, I guess, the y-axis of the graph, I usually think in terms of, I think the work functions in terms of material. And this is the material that comes through research, encounter, different things that I might encounter in the world, whether they be spectatorial encounters with other media, popular media, marginal media, and then also speculation. So the material of the work is largely constitutive of those things. Things in the world that I might have regard or concern for, and that's, I think, maybe a little bit more the political axis of the work, which is that, I think that the politics in the work are also somewhat anxious, because generally they have to do with things that I have I've only been introduced to as a spectator. So in some senses, my relationship to those politics and my relationship, say, to real-world events often is a matter of things that I have regard or concern for, but that I don't want direct contact with. But I think in art making, there's somewhat of a kind of a recklessness and a promiscuity with material that I welcome. I wouldn't necessarily want it in my politics, but in my art, I think it's a good thing. Somewhat problematic, though. So continuing down along the material axis, this is where we also have derivations of characters, actions, and settings in the work. For a recent project, Triangle of Need, material could also take the form of the setting itself, the location where the project was shot, Chicago and Miami, and contrasting economic realities. Music choreography, all of the details of the references within the music and choreography. And then, some things that I might have a kind of visceral response to, such as the antagonisms between the characters, or an antagonism that I might be feeling toward the location, or a kind of social, political, or kind of cultural consequence of working with this material. And then the other aspect of the material is anachronism. I've always been very interested in sort of, a really unstable sense of kind of time and place. And so often the works will try to locate opportunities for anachronism. So that's the y-axis, I suppose. And then on the x-axis, you have the kind of the approaches to the work. And in my case, they're generally performative, photographic, and video installation. I like to think of it as display, because video installation for me, in the venues that I have opportunity to work within, that's often what an installation will come down to is just, well, I have this photography that moves and it has sound and is constitutive of all of this content, but what's the kind of mechanism for display? So along that axis, there's usually approaches like scripting, scoring, rehearsing, arranging, and setting of music, all generally happening with a primary collaborator, composer Sean Griffin. Actions, which are often constitutive of ensemble vignettes, dialogue, original recordings, and the execution of choreography and the playing of a score. Then there's staging for the camera, the optical terrain of the subject, or of, I usually think of the kind of optical terrain of the work as being decided upon once I have a good sense of the material, so whether it's film or if it's video. Then usually early in the process also there's an approach which I have to think about compositions of these works over multiple screens. Then there's also for numerous venues, there's then generally several edits of the projects. So this project was constitutive of 3 components: a 4-channel projection, a 3-channel plasma screen display, and a 16-millimeter film transferred from Super 8 film stock. And so these 3 components were displayed respectively in the gallery. Then in the red, and this is kind of why I did this, because I hope it creates some sense of the experience of the work. You have what I call kind of animating gestures, and these are the historical derivation of the material, and that's always present in my mind. That some of the gestures in animating the material is they're methodologically unique, meaning working with a composer or a choreographer, or often choreographing things myself, there's a real permission that we give ourselves to simply invent methodologies for what we want to see. And with performance, I always find this particularly interesting, given that I really feel it's a discipline that while it has technique, it's kind of often you're sort of better off inventing your own. So one of the animating gestures for this project was Triangle of Need, was that it was concerned in an ideological sense with the popular imagination of the Gilded Age and its antagonisms. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The piece also it documents the past through it documents the present through a photography of the past, meaning some of the footage is shot in a discontinued Super 8 film stock, which is then transferred to 16 millimeter. Those shots are actually taken in of subjects in the present day, while at the same time it stages the past through a photography of the present. So there's this kind of aspects in which it's a kind of costume drama, yes, but there's a very kind of current photographic mechanism that's being used to depict that. Then another animating gesture that's pretty critical, I think, in most of the work is concern for my own symptoms. And this last project, Triangle of Need, was important for me in this sense because there were aspects of the material. One in particular, I was working with a silent movie catalog that had all these different scenarios in it that were, anywhere from sort of war reels to little fairy vignettes to comedies to just really blunt from start to stop kind of vaudeville routines, documentation of industry, agriculture, etc. So it was a catalog that had a kind of wide variety of silent films that in some way to me seemed like it embodied the imagination of the time where the project was set. And there's one scenario that I was really interested in, and I started working with it. It was about a traveling family who had hypnotized their daughter to appear as if she was to be asleep, so that then they could take her around and sort of put on a show with this girl who was sort of permanently asleep. So it was the story of trickery, where this family was sort of passing off their little girl as something that she was not, in order to get money, et cetera, et cetera. But in working with this scenario, I somehow in my mind had thought of them as gypsies. And it wasn't until I went back later and reread the original scenarios that I realized, well, no, they're actually not. It's not a gypsy family, and this is a kind of ethnicity that I've ascribed to this kind of shiftiness. So I felt like, okay, well, you know, I'm actually going to sort of capitalize on that. That was a sort of symptom of how I had kind of racialized this character. So that is something that deserves to be explored. And again, an animating gesture is sort of drawing out antagonisms between characters. I think watching the work is really to experience all of the elements on the y-axis, sort of pushing in to all of the elements on the x-axis, landing sometimes in a sort of perfect 50-50 combination. So infuse it, you know, x and y would be infused. So you would have all of these parts of the graph occupied by an infusion between x and y. But the experience of the piece would be in kind of watching these circles kind of move around, land on parts of the graph, exclude some things, include others. And that's the kind of progression. And that's the best way that I can describe it. I think if you try to follow these works as far as, you know, you have expectations that they're going to have a kind of narrative consequence. They don't. There's narrativity there, but it's not narration. As these circles would move around, some things would be left behind. Other things would kind of be very, very emphatic as the circles kind of came together. So it's very loose. And it kind of allows me to sort of, you know, for some things to play out in a really tangential fashion, and for other things to be very, very focused. And for me, that's the only kind of, that's the right analog, I think, for working in a living medium, for working with the time arts. I don't think about the work in this way before I make it. It's more that I thought it was important, or I have been thinking that it's been more and more important to give a good depiction of what the experience of watching the work is. I'll show you now what this work looks like. And so this would be the 4-channel projection shot. I was asked to make a project at a place called Vizcaya Museum and Gardens, which was the former home of a very wealthy American agricultural industrialist named James Deering. And he was manufacturing farm equipment, was a single man, decided to build kind of a sort of you could liken it to Hearst Castle on the Bay of Biscayne in Miami. And now it is, it's a municipal museum for the decorative arts, but they've started a contemporary art commissioning series. So when I went there, I was introduced, you do a kind of immersion visit, and I went there and I sort of felt very uncomfortable being there, because it sort of seemed like, you know, okay, this is really like a primal scene in the evolution of the concentration of wealth in America. And this particular time, the late Gilded Age American Renaissance moment, when you really have this kind of drive to concentrate that's lasted to the present day. So this is a four-channel component, mostly shot in Miami. Then this was the 16mm component that I described, shot on discontinued film stock and then transferred to 16mm. And that's the 3-channel component. So that's what the project ultimately looked like. Now, in terms of the material for the work, one of the important things, or in the research that I did while I was at Vizcaya, again, there was this silent film catalog, the Pathoscope Company of America. So that's where I was able to derive a lot of the scenarios that we used in the piece. And so a lot of the characters, actions, and settings were derived from these silent film scenarios. Then also in terms of the material, there was this, if you remember, spheres are kind of moving. They're not necessarily drawing consequential relationships or even analogous relationships, but there is something, as I'm working on this project, that I'm kind of letting be intuitive. So at about the same time, I was getting all of these spam emails from Nigeria. I'm sure everybody here has received one or two of them. But the story in the email is generally, it's a kind of, you're being asked to be presented as the next of kin to the person who's writing the email, so that that person and yourself can share the sum of like $20 million, something like this. And so, you know, but by and large, a lot of these emails were coming out of Nigeria, Ivory Coast, all of the third world countries. And so I thought, okay, well, you know, I have Vizcaya, I have this kind of $20 million that I can sort of throw into evidence in terms of, you know, giving a mise-en-scène to the email. So let's continue to allow that to be sort of part of then what works into the dialogue and what works into the action, and let's actually generate characters out of this email. So that's what we did. Then there's also kind of bearing down on the material is the fact that Vizcaya is in Miami, and James Deering, the very wealthy agricultural industrialist, his factory was in Chicago. And so on the top you see an aerial view of Vizcaya, on the bottom you see an idealized view of the Chicago factory. And on the left is the Dr. Patrick Obie's email. So then let's see, there's, you know, I very much took these two, let me go back to the material. So there's Vizcaya as a place, there's Dr. Patrick Obie's email, there's the evolution of the concentration of wealth, then there's my friend Sean Griffin, the composer, who at the same time is cultivating a Neanderthal language. It's based on some scientific research about what the physiology of the vocal tract of the Neanderthal is. And so from this, it's determined that you can actually sort of recreate what Neanderthals might have sounded like. So he was working on a Neanderthal language, which I thought was really interesting and could become part of this project, given that you had this kind of weird evolutionary issue with the Villa Vizcaya. You also had this kind of Dr. Patrick Obie trying to get you to present you as his next of kin. And then you had this kind of scientific metaphor for the Neanderthal that I thought was interesting, which is that, you know, the Neanderthal were extinct because they came into contact with Cro-Magnon man, who was brutal and violent, and the Neanderthals were sort of sweet souls, and ultimately the Neanderthal were extinct because the Cro-Magnons were so aggressive. So I thought that that was a kind of also interesting, you know, could be a sphere in the piece somewhere. We started to develop, Sean Griffin and I started to develop vignettes and scenarios for the characters. Dylan Skybrook, who was the choreographer for this piece, he started to develop choreography for it based, and this is where one of the animating gestures becomes historical derivation. So, you know, if the choreographer is thinking about this choreography, he's going to be interested, I think, as we all were, in the imagination of the time. And so that meant Isadora Duncan. It also meant scientific manuals about Neanderthal physicality, both approached in a kind of, and this is what I mean by methodologically unique. You know, on the one hand, we had sort of scientific renderings of the Neanderthals, but at the same time, you know, we were kind of interested in the popular imagination, so like diorama and things like this. And then throughout the course of working on the piece, you have the material, which is all inflected with all of these things, and things just start to kind of become infused. So I think it's probably a good time for me to show you what that looks like. Oh, I've lost half of my... Oh, I am mirroring. Sorry. These are all now. The music was lyrics by Edgar Allan Poe, a melody by Stephen Foster, translated into Neanderthal. And so in these scenes, you would see this kind of thread of narrative about these three women who were trying to get the last three Neanderthals to reproduce. You would see then characters that you saw in the Chicago component from the silent film catalog, all kind of running back and forth between this four-channel component and then this three-channel component. So when I say you have lyrics by Edgar Allan Poe and a melody by Stephen Foster in Neanderthal dialect, those things aren't sort of segmented in a way that you can experience. They're infused together. So this is the three-channel component, set in Chicago. A lot of the same elements. You have this kind of leitmotif of the Stephen Foster melody, the song Eulalie. And that becomes a leitmotif that then runs through the piece. So I think also you have, what I was hoping you would have is a sense of, okay, these two different geographic locations, one which is very expansive, where the imagination has license to do whatever it wants, but then this other one, the anachronistic Chicago tenement, where everything is kind of shut down, but is still kind of trying to get out. So you have generally the larger ensemble numbers taking place in the smaller architectural situation, and the kind of 2- and 3-person vignettes generally taking place in the more expansive location. So then the last component for this project was 16mm work, well, shown on 16mm film but shot on a discontinued 8mm stock. And 16mm. So this is also at the Villa Vizcaya, where they have, the place is also used for weddings and things like that, but it's also used very frequently by 15-year-old women, 15-year-old Latina women, for their quinceañera photography session. So on any given day at Vizcaya, you can see kind of many girls having these photo shoots, and for me this was, as I said before, that there's this idea of sort of taking a kind of a mode of display or a kind of visual mechanism from the past, but then making it look at something from the present. So that's how I consider this, the relationship of this component to all the others is, it flips it around in a way. It also locates this, the figure skater is this kind of classicism, but within a sort of within contemporary culture. It's also the two geographic locations, once again, Chicago, Miami collapsed then into one location. So that's Triangle of Need. I don't know, before I move on to something else, I don't know if anybody has any questions about this piece. Yeah.
I have a bunch of questions. Mm-hmm. So you shot in Miami and Chicago, and were both of them displayed in the same place?
Were both of them displayed in the same place?
Were they both, installed in the same space?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You had a, show you, you had one component which is here, up here, which is, it's all in the same space. So you had a 4-channel projected component, and then a 3-channel component presented on plasma screens right there, which would have represented Chicago.
And was this in Miami?
Did it take place in Miami?
Yeah, where was this happening? What gallery is this?
This is the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis.
Okay. And I have another question. How do you assemble the people that work on these projects with you?
It's a variety of things. Sometimes I do formal castings. Other times I look at, right now I live in Chicago, so a lot of what I'll do is actually go see theater in Chicago to see if there's anybody doing anything interesting. There's a lot of comedy in Chicago, so I go to comedy shows probably more than I used to. I have a lot of friends who are actors, so it's conventional and unconventional ways of doing casting.
Okay. And you said there's like some of the things that we're seeing are planned and others are not. Does that mean that like when you go to shoot like one of these like video sessions, do you like what's the process of that? Is it all scripted or is there amount of it like okay.
It's generally scripted. I mean, sometimes it's behavior that's been developed, and then it's a matter of kind of, you know, plotting that behavior into the location. But there's quite a lot of, I think that that's more the scripting process than anything else, is actually generating the behavior and then figuring out how it's going to be mapped into the setting.
So when you're shooting these videos, do you have an idea of what they're going to look like when they interact with one another in like the setting?
I mean, that's a lot of the earlier I described the kind of approach, which is conceiving of these things for multiple screens. So there's a question of, okay, well, one of the reasons I like to use the Steadicam quite a lot is because it's a way to sort of build in time in between shots that I know it's going to take for the eyes to be able to kind of assimilate 4 things moving at one time. So that's all a compositional process. You know, there's the aspects of the work which are, I think, somewhat random are, okay, well, you know, we generate a kind of, you know, a lot of, you know, volume of behavior, which, you know, may have started out with, you know, a silent film scenario, or may have started with a piece of dialogue or something like that. But generally, it's not edited down until we finally shoot it and we find a place for it, or it sort of goes away.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So then, I guess that's recent. So kind of wanted to, just for the sake of fun, show you something I did a long time ago. This is, I think, probably the second piece I ever realized. But sometimes I look at it and I kind of go, okay, you know, a lot has changed, and then nothing's really changed. So this is a theater work I did when I was a student at CalArts called Dad's Ham. And at CalArts they had this great permanent set where they used to teach the people in the film school how to do like 3 camera setups for TV. So it was all used for camera staging. But it was kind of, it had this fake living room, a fake kitchen. It was a whole sort of, you know, fake kind of soap opera set. And so I decided that I wanted to do this theater work on the set. And it had to do with 2 of these women, sort of theatrical divas, kind of torturing this man in his house. And the whole piece was basically all of the devices that he could invent for himself to resist their constant need to narrativize his life. So I'll just show you. So, you know, ridiculous things, like he would sort of, you know, he would just sort of read at them at times. He would, that's a repeat. He had, you know, objects and different things like that that he would make throughout the duration of the piece to try to kind of assault them. And then there were also, on the set, there was a series of feeds, video feeds that would go back and forth through the house. So we're watching at the same time as something was being shot. Oops. So that's something that I did very early on when I was a theater student. I was originally, I started out as an acting student, and then started to develop my own theater works like this. And then went on to do, when I was a graduate student, to do work specifically with video. And one of the first projects I did had to do with a sort of fake casting call, where I had all these texts that were kind of incoherent, but were very repetitive, and they were these sort of serial texts that would repeat the same sentiment over and over again. And I had this idea that the texts themselves could be used to kind of calibrate and animate different kinds of cultural signification on the part of actors in Los Angeles. And one of the texts was about a Les Paul, and it was a kind of guitar lesson using Les Paul. And the casting call, it said that it was looking for people to be part of a family drama about a father's battle with alcoholism. So I essentially got in this typology of people. I got fathers, I got mothers, I got sons, and I got daughters. But people would read a number of texts, some related to this domestic situation and other texts not, like this Les Paul text. Most of the time, but it was only some of the people who knew what a Les Paul was, so there were all kinds of funny things that came from that, and so I thought, haha, you know, these actors, they're so inauthentic. I need something to contrast this and demonstrate how inauthentic they are. So I'll go and I'll actually get real players of Les Pauls to come and play. And so the thing that I ultimately realized was when the Les Paul people came in, they were no less derivative than any of the actors. Each of the Les Paul people had a kind of a thing that they did, and a particular modality of playing the Les Paul, and you know, also were very comfortable on camera, and they were performers. So, you know, again, you had this situation where it was kind of, for me at the time, trying to use textual material or a theatrical device like the monologue to try to animate and also calibrate different effects. But it was a method of working that I wasn't, you know, it was sort of, once I did that, I didn't feel comfortable sort of continuing to lie to people and make these types of videos where you were just sort of, you know, there was really no mise en scène. You were just kind of looking at behavior. So then I started working on theater projects again, and the first one that, so I was in graduate school mainly working on videos most of the time, but for my thesis production, I decided to do a theater project, and there was a TV show on in the late '90s called When Animals Attack, and I was really interested in this one attack that I saw. It was a bear attacking this poor woman, and it really fascinated me because it was sort of like the bear was fine, and he was with the trainer, and you know, they'd obviously done this, you know, many times, but there was something about this particular woman. She sort of sat down and she kind of smiled slightly, and the bear attacked. So I was kind of thinking about two things at the time. One was like, well, you know, how would theater, or what are the devices that theater has invented for itself to depict things like trauma? I became really interested in that question because in something like When Animals Attack or these videos, obviously you can just show it. But on the stage, I mean, there have been different traditions in theater, like the Prague Biennial, where you would have these elaborate productions of this kind of this sort of staged bloodletting. But you know, I was kind of trying to think about, okay, well, what are these devices that theater has invented to depict trauma? At the same time, how are those devices ideologically motivated? And what are these different movements in the theater that have all had a stake in an issue like primacy? You know, so I chose 3 theatrical modalities. One was German expressionist theater, where I could locate a kind of economy of conventions to play with, and that would certainly be very vivid in terms of its attitude toward trauma. The other one was naturalism in the manner of Chekhov, like a sort of domestic naturalism. So what would the bear attack be through, like, you know, this kind of naturalistic drama? How would you depict the bear attack through minimalist dance? These different movements that all seem to me to have a very particular orthodoxy, to have a particular sort of representational regime, and that again could be sort of placed in an antithetical relationship to one another. So I developed a number of scenes, hoping to kind of play out these 3 theatrical modalities. But then at a certain point it was like, okay, well, what's happening with the performers and what's happening in this particular piece? And so whereas I felt like I had a lot of baggage and really, you know, wanted to unleash expressionism on minimalism, and sort of vice versa, maybe to make either of them suffer, I don't know, that was kind of my fun in it all. There was also the issue of well, you know, this poor woman sitting next to the bear, and what that was, what that could potentially mean in terms of an investigation of individual persona, the particulars of an individual persona that would make a bear want to attack, that would want to make me look at that person, that would make me want to not look at that person. You know, what is compelling about some performers? How does a performer move from the beginning of a piece to the end of a piece in time, developing a persona that as the author I could potentially play with. The whole issue of sort of remembering this trauma, you know, remembering in a kind of naturalistic modality versus like a hardcore repetition within a minimalist orthodoxy. And so, I mean, even as I'm talking about it, it starts to dissolve. And so it again was a piece that started out with a very fixed thing that I wanted to do, but once that fixed thing was subjected to the ecology of making a theater work, I hope I did more interesting things. So one of the things I did early on when I was after this bear attack was in the old video making way that I was involved in, I sort of did a casting call and asked people to play bears and victims, and then eventually did a theater work in a set that was constructed into an orchestra pit of a theater. So the audience would sit on those bleachers there, and then watch the action happening down below. And then the sets and the objects and things like that were sort of an attempt to again, sort of infuse these stylistic visual conceits then of my 3 theatrical modalities. So that was my thesis project, which was then, you know, I was still making videos, but then at that point decided that I sort of clearly wanted to be doing both, making films and videos, but also working in the theater. So let's see. we leave some time for questions. How much time for questions? 15 minutes. I'll just try to go through this, go through some things quickly. Maybe something that you haven't, that hasn't been seen, is a series of performances and one video that kind of was inspired, well, it sort of grew out of my fascination for this picture as a kind of avant-garde classic. It's Joseph Beuys at a Fluxus Festival from 1964, the Festival of New Art. It took place in Aachen, Germany, and it happened that it was a festival of 12 Fluxus artists who, organized by an architecture student. The festival was going to take place, or it was scheduled to take place at the Technical Academy in Aachen in 1964. And as the sort of history has it, the technical students in Aachen at the time weren't particularly sympathetic with Fluxus. And a melee ensued. There was, I wouldn't say it was like super violent disruption, but it was disruption. And it to me, it sort of, you know, it was very sort of attractive thing to look at, because here you had a Fluxus festival that was supposed to be about kind of, you know, these discrete actions. But that it had ultimately become kind of an opera with a very, very strong protagonist. And ultimately then out of that grew this kind of very iconic photograph of Joseph Beuys. So I was interested in this Festival of New Art event in Aachen, and at the same time I was working at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, which is a museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And in the 40s, they had a very ambitious museum director named Chick Austin, who liked to, he was a really good museum director, but part of what he liked to do was also design and star in plays at the museum. And so one of the things that he did was he did a play called "'Tis Pity She's a Whore." It's a Jacobean play about incest. And in the 1940s, there was this, a similar misfire. Well, there was a misfire in the sense that the audience in Hartford wasn't very receptive to this story of incest for reasons that you can imagine. And so it was this. I thought it was a nice, another kind of manifestation of, you know, intention, kind of. Greeting an unwelcoming social context, and a social context that rejects it. And that then that gesture becomes, it's like misfire. In the same ways that the actors reading about the Les Paul with such an enthusiasm, when they say Les Paul, it's kind of, you know, it's misplaced. And so I can't quite describe what it is that I think is sort of important about misfire, other than that it seems to kind of immediately throw both the gesture and the context into a kind of high relief. And so in a sense it becomes a kind of way to look at these kinds of cultural occasions. So anyway, I took this Festival of New Art 1964 Aachen and the Chick Austin production of "'Tis Pity She's a Whore," and once again I sort of infused them together into a piece that had the Fluxus actions from Aachen performed in the manner of a Jacobean drama, shot then within the original theater where the Chick Austin misfire happened, and then had the Fluxus actions the Fluxus actions performed in the Jacobean manner, and the Jacobean play performed in the manner of Fluxus, as I could sort of as I sort of gave it a kind of a set of Fluxus style, a sort of set of attributes. You know, and it's ascribing attributes to historical things that I only have an encounter with as a spectator. That's kind of, you know, that's, I don't want to say the promiscuity of the work, because that makes it sound good. I don't know. It's more that I think that, you know, art is a really good place to work with cultural material in a disobedient way, and it's not for me necessarily about being irreverent or antagonistic or transgressive in any way. It's more that for me it's a sort of productive way to look at these politics or these kinds of cultural issues, but to not have to be sort of focused on the question of them, as opposed to being obsessed with the answer. And it's a way also to allow myself to continue to be indirect, to deal with social and cultural material in a way that privileges a certain indirectness. So the final outcome of this work was a 2-channel projection, and that's the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford on the left, and the Audimax in Aachen, Germany on the right. So let's see, these are some stills. Those you won't be able to see those. So this project also included several performances, and so I wanted to take some of the same ideas, this Jacobean material that was kind of being pressured by this Fluxus modality and vice versa, and take up another aspect of the Festival of New Art, which is this, which was the question of how the nature of collaboration has changed, I guess, since that moment in time. So I decided that I wanted to do a series of collaborations that would respond to the venue in some way, but that would also invite several other people to actually look at these Fluxus actions and to look at this material, and to see if we could sort of similarly stage something nice and democratic and sort of polyvocal, like the Festival of New Art. But the more invitations I sent out, nobody was interested in doing it. So it was like, I sent out many invitations to many artists. Nobody was interested in participating. And so I kind of thought, okay, well, you know, I still want to do something. Maybe I don't ask people to restage Fluxus actions. Maybe that's what they're responding to. But then I also thought, okay, well, so the content for it should be open. So the first one came along, and it was getting later and later, and I had no participants. I had no other artists wanting to participate. So in Hartford, I invited 2 students from the high school to perform some of the scenes. So they were present and participating. And then I was able to ultimately work with old friends, several old friends that I have who are still making art. So that was the first collaboration in Hartford, with some images of it on the left. Then the second one that I did was in Lyon, France. So the first one was the Wadsworth manifestation. The next one we did was in Lyon and Dijon, France, at the Opera de Lyon, in their kind of studio space. And so whereas you had these other venues which, well, or where the project itself was very much driven by, you know, the location of Aachen or the location of Hartford, at the Opera de Lyon it was a black box theater, so it really had no, the only other referent that it would have had really would be all of the other productions that had ever been performed in that space or by the opera. So I decided to take the material and to actually develop new behavior. Some were still invested in these flexus actions. There were still some archetypes from Tis Pity She's a Whore, but that there would be a choreography that would have to do with the props from the opera, and that the actors would develop this choreography, and then when we got to Lyon, they would be sort of forced to assimilate all of these opera props into their choreography. So that was the Lyon manifestation. And there were three elements. There were opera vignettes, there were flexus actions, and then there was a score for percussion. So most of the action was executed over a very kind of detailed percussion score. So that was that manifestation. Then the final one took place back in the Audimax in Aachen, and on a set in a theater, in the Volksbühne Theater in Berlin. Now for this one, so I had done the Wadsworth manifestation, the Lyon-Dijon manifestation, and then this was the final one, the fourth one. I was able to, there were a few more people interested in participating at this point than in the first one. And so the collaborators were Ron Athey, Mike Kelly, a Polish actor named Marek Cichucki, a performance artist from Copenhagen named Vera Mader, the composer I generally collaborate with, Sean Griffin, and I consider the costume designer a collaborator in this work. So again, it was kind of, you know, the form was pretty open. Everybody submitted material, and I think a lot of my interest in this project to begin with was to sort of take on the conceits of what I had considered at the time, and this is probably part of the baggage that I was carrying, was to take on the sort of anti-theatrical conceits of Fluxus. Because you'd had this event where this kind of a very heroic protagonist had emerged, Joseph Beuys, this kind of hero for the avant-garde. And so similar to that, and looking again for this analogous misfire, one of the reasons for wanting to do a collaboration with multiple people to begin with was to say, okay, well, you know, maybe there's some kind of aesthetic conflict that will come throughout this project, where aspects of one person's, where we'll all have to deal with the aesthetics of the other people, and that the piece will be orchestrated to find those contrasts. So that's a poster from the original event. That's a shot of the melee in Aachen. So there was, you know, several hundred people there. It's quite amazing. And then there was some material from Ron Athey. And then Mike Kelly had given us the texts for the extracurricular activity projective reconstruction. The last piece that he did, I think it was the last piece he did here in New York. He gave us the text, and I thought, well, they're not related to Fluxus, but they do have to do with this kind of this institutionalized pathology. And so then the approach to making the work, again, was not to have a kind of an experience where you would sort of segment each participant's contribution. Like you would have here's the collaborators and then here's the program. I wanted it to be much more internally hostile, I guess. And so here's what something looks like when it's, I guess, just a true infusion of all of the collaborators.
So it was an empty spot there, so I had to fill it with something. With a breast my mama thought it up. Well, she said a big star like Garth Brooks might need a little bait. So he got a lot of fans. I had to put something special in there. Well, it's not even my tit. It's my mama's. I couldn't get a proper view of my own to paint it, so I painted hers. Gosh. I hope Garth don't go for my mama and not for me.
So I just want to show you just how the set for this piece. This was a set by Bert Neumann, and the audience sat. This wasn't for me. This was for that theater's production of The Idiot by Dostoevsky. So it was kind of, you sat on the stage and then the set sort of revolved. There's the audience sitting on the scaffolding on the stage, and then the stage revolved. So you had this kind of unfolding of this sort of cityscape. And so for us it was kind of, again, it was a lot of what the methodology usually becomes, about generating material, generating this behavior, and then it's only very late in the process that the location is revealed or the set is revealed. So usually things are pretty much sort of battle planned right into a venue which has which shows evidence of another use, and that's something that I hope is available in the work, is that what you're looking at are not necessarily sets or spaces that were created for my productions, but they're loaded with meaning in another way. Hopefully, what then the theater does to it, or my ensemble does to it, is they make it permeable. And so it's pretty much in every case that every setting is chosen specifically for that reason, to agitate further content, and for the content to, you know, maybe agitate it in some way. But I go usually from the live performances to the videos. I mean, it's material that's conceived of at the same time, and most of the time I sort of have an idea that it'll be manifest as a film project, and it'll also eventually be manifest in the theater. I think what changes is more just the attitude towards it's. In the theater, I can't control it, and I also can't control what people are looking at, and I enjoy that. Whereas it's the format of a film which is so kind of heavily edited in advance, whereas in the theater, your eyes have the pleasure to look wherever they like. And that's really the difference. Is I enjoy the experience in theater, I enjoy the experience in live performance when I can fixate on very incidental things. I think to some degree in the film works there's some of that going on because they're multi-screen presentations, so you're free to fixate on the details. You don't always have to, I don't have to kind of guide the action in the same way. It's a different kind of authorship.
Do you have some idea that you want to provoke something in the viewer? I mean, I think Dada, and I think minimalist, and then I think catharsis, and I'm just curious what your view is. Is it just you presenting something, or do you hope that a viewer responds? And it seems to me cathartically. I saw your work at Metro Pictures, and I had no idea of any of this, and this completely informs what I saw. And it's very different. I found it to be very lush, and when I saw it, and very seductive. So as I'm hearing you say all this, it's very, very interesting, but I'm curious what your interest is in doing the work.
I don't know if you were here earlier. Oh, okay, that graph that I showed, I mean, that's, to me, that's the activity. You know, it's, I think, you know, again, I'd like to focus on the question more than the answer, you know, by and large. And so I think that's the internal progress of the work is in some ways related to historical sensation. And, you know, again, orthodoxies and sort of regimes and other pieces which I didn't show, which have to do about a kind of arbitrariness and brutality. And, you know, I guess some other kind of generally expressive things that I think you can sort of sense and intuit, but maybe not sort of squarely. I guess it's an experience for the viewer that is impossible to ultimately assimilate, but yet provides a sort of numerous different kinds of sensations, both sort of thought sensations and, you know, I don't know, other kinds of sensations.
I was wondering if you could maybe talk about specific artistic influences. I mean, it seems like with each piece, you're dealing with so many you're pulling from so many references all over the place. But I was more interested in kind of like an underlying influence. I mean, in the film, the film and video work specifically made me think of like this lineage from like Maya Deren to like Kenneth Anger and David Lynch sort of thing. But also it seems like Fluxus is like a big aspect of your work. I'd be interested to see.
I mean, I think probably there's a lot of influences, but I think probably the biggest one in terms of maybe the methodology of the work is Buto, the Buto of a choreographer named Tatsumi Hijikata. So that, and then Godard and Richard Foreman, and I mean, a kind of a cinematic trajectory would be Strab-Huillet. So those are some of them.
Hi.
Oh.
Wondering if you ever performed in your own work and why you've chosen not to.
I mean, I was an actress for a long time, but never in my own pieces. I did when I was in. I lived in Japan for 2 years, and there was a piece there that I performed in. But I had such anxiety, so much about just acting and my kind of. I just sort of wanted to get off myself and think about other things, and so that's one of the primary reasons why I got out of it. So, no.
What was it like for you, though, to go into these productions with an acting background while you were in school? What was that transformation like?
I mean, I think I could. I didn't detest actors in the way that a lot of my colleagues in the visual arts did. I had more of a kind of. I had a sympathy. I also knew the regimes that they had been trained through and under, so I had that as a kind of I had that as kind of like common vocabulary. You know, I kind of had a sense of what they might like to do, and also a sense of what they might not like to do at all. And so, I mean, I think that's been one of the easier aspects of the work. But also, at the same time, the hardest one to really gauge, you know, you know, it may be that I expect, you know, the acting in the work to do too much of the work. I think that would be a fair criticism. And that's also, I think, part and parcel with the fact that the work primarily has been received within the visual arts and not within the performing arts. So, you know, if I was in the performing arts, there would be, you know, often people who might have an understanding of the different kinds of formalisms within sort of actor training or theater or whatever that might be able to relate to the work in a way that's different than people in the visual arts. So it's maybe a lot of ways to answer your question.
How accessible do you let your process? How accessible to the audience do you let your process be? Are you helping them along with text, or do you just let them have sensations and kind of get it to the depth they want to?
I mean, I'm trying to think if there's ever a piece where I've ever sort of exposed the process or kind of, you know, again, this is always, I always thought that in the theater, you know, to kind of bear the device was a sort of, a really kind of, I don't know, tacky conceit, you know, in a way. Like, well, but that's there, you know, there's a whole convention of that. But it does become a particular problem if you want to sort of like bolster it to delineate things for people.
When you showed those images of the Chicago-Miami piece at the beginning, I saw a lot of text.
There
is
are.
That available in the gallery?
Yes.
Or is that
Yeah.
all?
Yeah. I mean, it's many people would say that the text was yet another thing.
Well, I just wondered if you're helping people along to get it, because it is really complex and rich. Is that available to them, or do they?
I mean, I think I don't try to. I wanted the text to be. I wanted you to have this experience of these subtitles that would give you access to the piece. So I mean, that was my intention with it. You know, at the same time, I do have a particular feeling about the degrees, the degrees to which people, you know, it's this question of, understanding things. And of course, I want them to experience something and think about things, but the degree to which it all needs to be then kind of brought into focus, I don't put my effort there. Again, it's those spheres that are kind of, creating some sort of sensation of familiarity, but then at other times kind of moving to another place on the grid.
Yeah, I always just wonder how much a person wants someone to get it, or else to have it for themselves, but also to, help people to get it so they can make the connections and grow in a kind of social sense.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, with that piece, it was important to me, or it would have been important to me, that people walk away asking themselves, okay, well, why are the characters in one locale where anything seems possible, and then why are they in another locale where nothing seems possible? That is a basic kind of economic reality of each location that that would be important to me, that contrast was evident. But sometimes there's other things that people, I think that's again the fascinating thing about an ensemble is you never know what people will be compelled to watch. It may just be some idiosyncratic thing on the part of one of the performers that sort of they get really caught up in and attached to. So the whole issue in this medium with identification, and how you're on the one hand fighting that battle of like, okay, well, people are identifying with all kinds of crazy things, or how you're having fun with that battle. And then on the other front, it's like, well, but this is kind of motivated by a certain political concern, or a certain, social concern. So it's kind of like, well, what am I going to prioritize? And again, as I said, for me, indirectness is, for me, that's an effective analogy to the kind of social politics that I'm interested in to begin with. So, and I'm not a Zen person, is the other thing. I just can't, just kind of land the flowers and everything like in the right way. It's just kind of,
I'm interested in the way that you're describing those symptoms that you have and how you intersect those with the process that you're building around a project, or how you decide that a symptom is worth pursuing or worth ignoring.
Well, I mean, often if I laugh at something, even if it's not intended to be humorous, I usually keep it in. I mean, I think that's one of the things, is like I trust laughter. And on other occasions, such as the one I described where, I had ascribed an ethnicity to this character, then it was like the character became a leitmotif, and the character became kind of emblematic of then a kind of racial antagonism that you know, you can feel in those old places in the States that you go to, and you know that it was very different then. So that's a kind of weird relationship between something that's sort of, you know, you just kind of have to let it play out. Or, you know, there's one, if there's ever a person of ethnicity in the work, the kind of conspicuity of an African-American person in an all-white cast, and what you're going to do about the conspicuity of that person there, and how to kind of say, well, okay, well, you know, maybe it's symptomatic that, you know, I'm asking him to do this or that, but, you know, just let it play out. You know, don't try to kind of correct it.
It also seems to me like in the piece with the Miami setting that there's a reference somehow to the D.W. Griffith films. There's a real parallel for me somehow with some of the dialogue in that film. And early D.W. Griffith, I can't remember the name of the film. Can anybody? It's somebody said it. Birth of a Nation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's the period. I mean, it's also that so many of the costumes are derived. So many of the archetypes are derived from the period. You know, I mean, those are things where at the same time that they're specific, they're made into something that can be generally recognizable. Nope. Thank you very much. Thank you.